In today's video, we're taking a look at some Montreal Canadiens trade rumors, which are basically spawned from the offer sheet for Jerard Kotkaniemi. How will they react? How will they replace him at center ice? Will they turn around and make a bigger move to go after a more experienced center? We'll discuss all the possibilities coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, today we're talking about the Montreal Canadiens. Not a huge surprise after the bombshell news we got last night with the Carolina Hurricanes signing Jerard Kotkaniemi to a one-year offer sheet valued at $6.1 million. In case you missed it, there is another video on the channel discussing in more details, but the Hurricanes did like the ultimate troll job here. They obviously structured everything so that it was obviously very highly paid. Not only that, there's a $20 signing bonus, which is an ode to Sebastian Aho's jersey number 20, of course, in retaliation to the Aho offer sheet from 2 years ago. We've got the ending point of the salary for Kotkaniemi is $6.1 million and $15, which is Kotkaniemi's number 15. They took their Twitter page. They changed it to French. They tweeted things out in French. This is the complete troll job. Not to mention as well, Don Waddell, when he released a statement on the offer sheet, basically mimicked almost word for word the statement released by Marc Bergevin regarding the Aho offer sheet 2 years ago, right to a T. You could take out Aho and Canadiens and put in Kotkaniemi and Hurricanes, and it was identical. So clearly, this was not only a case of revenge, but it certainly, in my opinion, is a case of them wanting the player as well. This is a combination of both scenarios. Now, a couple of things that have come out since that has taken place. For one, we've got the latest 31 Thoughts podcast with Elliotte Friedman giving a lot of other inside information that he was aware of and knew about. We've got some comments as well from Darren Dreger of TSN and an article from Eric Engels of Sportsnet talking about the reaction, the fallout, and how they can proceed from here. Do they match? Do they let the player go? Do they take the compensation, shop it around? And we're going to discuss all of that here and how we feel the reaction is going to go down from Montreal's perspective. So at the end of the day, they very well have a lot to consider here. Now, before we jump into that, I do want to pause just for a quick second. I do want to remind you quickly that we do have a merchandise sale that is going on. It's only got 2 days left and it ends as of midnight on the 31st. Today's the 29th. These hoodies have been selling very, very well, so thank you very much for all your recent support. I'll put the graphic on the screen so you can get the promo codes. There's a different promo code depending if you live in Canada or the United States. One gives you free shipping, one gives you a discount, and it's just because we can't do free international shipping. So ultimately, get yours today before the special runs out. There will be a future promos going on, but the promos that we're available and able to offer through the merch company changes all the time. So take advantage here. Like I said, a lot of sales have been, we've had a record month in sales. So I do thank you again for that and all your support. Now, getting back to the Habs here. Now, of course, what we can look at is if the Montreal Canadiens decide to not match the offer, they get a first-round pick as well as a third-round pick from the Carolina Hurricanes as compensation. We know exactly what that's going to be. So the general consensus here amongst everybody that we've kind of looked at from the NHL insider standpoint is that the Habs are very, very likely going to take as much time here as they can to make a decision. They have up to 7 days to decide on this, and there's no point in rushing because they have it's a big decision. Obviously, with this offer sheet of $6.1 million, it's also going to come a requirement to tender a qualifying offer to him at the same value next year. Now, here's the information that gets really interesting from Elliotte Friedman. Friedman goes on to say that he believes that when the Hurricanes and Kotkaniemi and his agents were discussing this, that they have already kind of discussed what a long-term deal could look like. So clearly, when I talked about it yesterday, saying, okay, Carolina is in a situation here where they're overpaying for the player, but it's not like they can just overpay for the 1 year because they're going to be obligated to offer him that much next year on a new contract. But there is a caveat here in that he could agree to take less, clearly, right? I mean, that's just what they're obligated to offer if he wants to play hardball. But Friedman believes, based on what his knowledge of the situation is that they've already discussed what that long-term deal could look like, and he believes that they've already kind of sort of have a handshake agreement, I guess you could say, on that amount, and it's going to be less than the 6.1, so the Carolina Hurricanes are not really going to be obligated to get to that point. If they do an extension and they both agree to a lesser number on a longer-term deal, that's totally acceptable. And them talking about a longer-term deal with him now is also completely legal and acceptable under the rules as well, because he is technically a free agent. Like, so they could have gone over multiple scenarios for offer sheets or what the future could look like by him signing and making the jump to their franchise should the offer sheet not be matched. So from that perspective, it makes really good sense that the Hurricanes are obviously very prepared here. And at the end of the day, like I was saying yesterday, not really thinking that this could be something that might be possible, that the Hurricanes are not going to be necessarily paying him more than the $6 million on a longer-term basis. Now, on Montreal's side of things, do they want to keep this player? Do they want to take those picks and shop them around? You'd have to think, though, that between everything else that's transpired this offseason, if they lose Kotkaniemi to the Hurricanes and they have already lost Philip Deneau to Los Angeles in free agency, that leaves Nick Suzuki and then what, Jake Evans? I mean, Eric Staal also played center for them last year as a free agent, not signed right now. You would have to think that Montreal is going to have to scour the trade market to try to find a suitable replacement center iceman, because that leaves them awfully thin down the middle. I mean, you'd have to think they're going to have conversations with Arizona, I think, which was rumored that they did before, around Christian Dvorak. Now they suddenly would have a couple of extra picks that they would be willing to flip in a package to acquire him. So that's a player who's under a longer-term deal, just shy of $4.5 million. He's still in his early 20s, a good checking two-way center. In fact, he probably would play a very similar role to Kotkaniemi, except he's got a little bit more history and a little bit more established, being a little bit more offensive. Not to say that Kotkaniemi couldn't get there in the next few years after getting some more experience. He very well could, but Dvorak is already there now. So it's not an outrageous contract. I know the rumored asking price was a first-round pick and a prospect. Well, suddenly now the Habs have an extra first-round pick, so they could certainly throw that in there along with one of their other prospects, and that deal suddenly becomes a lot more likely to get done. Or do they go a little bit bigger scale here and go hardcore after Jack Eichel? Now, we know that the Habs have been involved to a degree in the Eichel sweepstakes here, but they're not really, I guess you could say, one of the main players in these conversations. We've talked before that insiders like Friedman and others have mentioned that the Montreal Canadiens have been involved and had some exploratory conversations with him, with the Sabres around an Eichel trade, but it's not believed at this point that they were serious to the point that they were one of the leading offers or really were like at the forefront of the teams making a play for this player here, and that, you know what, it's pretty unlikely that it was going to get done. But this changes everything. It creates a much bigger need for Montreal at the position for starters. And like I said, number two, if they lose Kotkaniemi, they have some extra draft currency that they could use to make a trade offer more enticing. Now, it still doesn't mean that the Sabres are going to change their asking price. And you know what? I still think that the asking price for Montreal would be pretty substantial, and it still could be really complicated and might not really stand a great chance to get done. But still, it gives him Bergevin more leverage and some more assets that would be intriguing to the Sabres in that regard. So a couple other key points here, though, that was brought up by a couple of these guys, including on the podcast here from Friedman and Jeff Merrick, talking about the fact, and I guess if you really think about this, that things didn't really end on a good note for Kotkaniemi in Montreal last year. I mean, the last 2 years, really, he's been yo-yoed in and out of the lineup, spent some time in the minors, and then last year, of course, ended the season on the final 2 games as a healthy scratch. He had missed time, been due to being a healthy scratch in other playoff games earlier in the playoffs as well. It just seems like it's fair to say that the Habs and Kotkaniemi, like the confidence wasn't there from the team for him to be a prominent role playing every game in the most important ones at that. So that obviously goes to show that, you know, it's a different relationship. And obviously that's probably impacted how he felt as well. If Carolina is coming to him with a more of a promise on a regular role, you don't have to go to the minors, you're going to be a big part of our team, that would entice him along with the money. That's life-changing money. Now, it's also reported in this podcast, according to Friedman, he believes that the Montreal Canadiens and Kotkaniemi, and when it comes to talking about a new contract, they were nowhere near getting a deal done, and they were also nowhere near this $6.1 million. He believes that they were somewhere around a 2-year deal, around $2.5 million. And I also saw comments from other NHL reporters, like I said, including Darren Dreger and what Friedman mentioned, asking around the league. And Eric Engels, I believe, mentioned this in his article too. It actually was Engels that mentioned that he talked to a variety of sources around the league, just saying, what do you feel this contract would be or should be? And a lot of them were in the same sort of ballpark, in that $2 to $3 million range for a couple of years. So this is more than double, in some cases triple, what people felt that was a fair deal for this player on his next contract. But if Carolina is that confident in him and his ability to grow into what they feel he's going to become and being a star player, or at least a very prominent player, then overpaying for 1 year to get him for a small compensation package is probably could be worth it. I guess stress could be, because we don't know how he'll develop, and then sign him to a longer term extension at less money, maybe in that $4 million range. We really don't know what was discussed. Friedman didn't have a figure, just saying what he had believed to be taking place, but he didn't know what that number was. So that, could make sense, I guess. They have to be real high on the player. Of course, he was drafted right after Andrei Svechnikov. I'm sure the Hurricanes are quite familiar with him in a sense that they would have spent a lot of time in their scouting department looking at him when he was draft eligible. And apparently the other part of this that's not overly shocking or surprising here is that the Carolina Hurricanes and the Montreal Canadiens apparently were engaged in trade conversations around Kotkaniemi leading up to this taking place, and that the Hurricanes apparently made it known that if they could not work out a trade, that they very well were likely going to do this, probably within like 24 hours or so of it actually taking place. So Bergevin and the Habs should not have been completely blindsided by this, where they were already engaged in trade conversations, but they were nowhere near the point where Montreal was willing to agree to the deal and make it happen. So obviously that changed things for the Hurricanes. We don't know exactly what the offer was. I would assume it could be somewhere similar to what they're going to end up giving up through the offer sheet process if they're successful in landing this player. But clearly it's a case of revenge tactics from Dundon and Waddell. But it's like I said, they have to be high on this player to make it happen, because they have to know that there's a real possibility the Habs might just take the compensation and walk away. Now they're stuck with the guy here at $6 million. But it makes a lot more sense now knowing that as soon as they're able to, they could sign him to a longer-term extension at a lower value that's more reasonable, and kind of go about things that way and work with him to develop into the player they feel he's going to become. As I mentioned, they have enough finished players there. He'd probably be very comfortable. And you know what? Like I said, this is a situation with the Aho offer sheet. It's almost like Montreal did them a favor, really, because at the end of the day, they did not end up with a contract for Aho that was unfavorable. The only part of it that was probably not real fond of from the ownership was the bonus structure, but as far as the actual money that they're paying him, who you can say he's a top 15, top 20 player in the NHL, is very fair, very reasonable. So that aspect, they really didn't handcuff the Canes that bad of a predicament. Many people felt the offer sheet was weak and kind of didn't really accomplish what it should have, whereas this one, completely different. They do handcuff the Habs. They're in a situation where matching becomes extremely difficult, and at the same time, also, a tough predicament. I mean, Kotkaniemi may not want to agree to a longer-term deal with Montreal at this lower value like he has talked about with Carolina. He may force them into offering more of that offer, the qualifying offer amount, which is going to really hurt. They're going to end up losing additional members of their roster because of their new cap situation. And is it really worth it? And as we've seen in the past, when offer sheets are signed, it does tend to impact the relationship, just like arbitration. The odds of him sticking with the Habs for a super long period of time after this, I think, would be slim. And where they were already having trade conversations around him leading up to this, I would think next year that they would be doing it all over again. Because if they do match the offer sheet, they can't trade him for a while. There is some limits on that. They will have to keep him for the season. But at the same time, doesn't mean he'd be there beyond that. So at the end of the day, I do feel his time in Montreal is either over now or in the very short term, and the Habs need to address the center situation, because they went from a team a few years ago where they were really weak at the position. They didn't have much depth. They built it up. They traded for Suzuki. They drafted Kotkaniemi. Danault really emerged, and now two of those three pieces are suddenly not there anymore if this all goes through. The other and key important point here as well I'm going to make out here is that Nick Suzuki, who's emerged as their #1 center, is 1 year away from getting his next contract because he's entering the last year of his ELC. He needs an extension. You know that he's going to be able to command a big long-term deal because he's had a phenomenal breakout season in the last couple of years here. Like, he's really come through. So he's going to get paid handsomely on a longer-term contract. Montreal would obviously be wanting to keep him, but I would assume they're going to now make it a priority to get that contract done before any offer sheet can be tendered in that regard. Because if they match Kotkaniemi, which I'm not convinced they're going to do, but if they do, are the Carolina Hurricanes going to then come after Suzuki next year? Like, it really makes you wonder. So what can happen? I think they need to protect themselves and get that deal done. And the other thing, too, is Kotkaniemi and Suzuki are under the same NHL agency. They don't have the exact same agent, but they are under the same agency. Now, Kotkaniemi deals with Marcus Leto, whereas Suzuki's under Dave Gagne, but they're both under Wasserman Hockey. So same agency. They obviously would know and share all that information. So it wouldn't be a shock if the Habs continue to come under fire here if they do keep Kotkaniemi. I don't know. The other question, too, is that some people have raised is, do they let Kotkaniemi go and offer sheet a guy like Pettersson? I'm going to dismiss that and say I don't think that's really a possibility because of the cap situation. How can they really do that? They would have to shed a bunch of other contracts, and that's not going to be easy at this time of year. So as much as it's a nice thought and fun to think about, creates more chaos in the NHL, I don't see that happening. I do see much more likely that they make a trade and go after either Christian Dvorak, which is way more reasonable, or they really try to push more all in and get Jack Eichel and hope that they can go with an Eichel-Suzuki 1-2 down the middle. But I wouldn't be shocked if the Sabres insist on having Suzuki in the deal, and that's not something Montreal is going to do. So let me know your thoughts on how the Habs react. Do they match the offer sheet? Do they not? Do they let them go and make a trade? Who's their best target? Give me all your thoughts down in the comments. It's going to be a really interesting conversation over the next few days as this all plays out. If you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the latest news, rumors, and analysis on all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.